Welcome back everyone. In today's video I want to show you two powerful techniques to create dynamic tables in Shiny. By that I mean tables that have some components that you can click on and then some other part in your Shiny app code gets triggered and something happens in your app. In our case, we'll make sure that a pop-up window shows up, but really this technique can be used for all kinds of cases, and you will unlock a whole new skill when you master the techniques that I'm showing you here. So let's dive in. Alright, in my R script I've set up a little dummy app to demonstrate how all of this works. We start out by checking out the dataset that we're going to use, which comes from the GT package, and it's called Pizza Place. It shows you 50,000 rows of sold pizza that we sold over the year. And I've taken this dataset and grabbed only the first 500 rows of it, and then I created a new column that I call Cryptic ID, which is just a random string of numbers and letters. And this may sound confusing, but it will all become pretty clear in a second why we want to have such a column. In any case, we save this data set, and then inside of our user interface we really have only the title and the GT table output, which we render inside of our server function by taking this data set, grabbing only 4 columns, sticking this into GT, and then making it interactive so that we don't flood our user interface with the full 500 rows, but instead have just 5 at a time. And if we look at this, this looks something like this. So you see here we have our 4 columns: date, time, price, and cryptic ID, which are the ones that we have selected in our code. And also we can paginate through these pages here to see different rows of our data set. So now what I want to do is to make this cryptic ID column into a button. And for that we're going to do a really simple HTML and CSS trick, namely we're just going to wrap this into A tags, namely anchor tags, which are links inside of HTML, and then we're going to link a specific action to that link. So what we're going to do inside of our mutate call is we're going to compute a new column that I call cryptic ID link, and to compute this column I'm just going to iterate over our cryptic ID column, and for each cryptic ID I'm just going to create an A tag that has the text show me inside of it, and because we need to make a character string out of this, we have to pass this thing to as character. And now if I re-execute this whole thing, we see now that okay, right now it didn't change at all because right now we're still using cryptic ID inside of our app. So let's use our new column here instead. And now if we re-render this, we see that okay, everywhere we have these show me labels here. So that's pretty boring, but what we can do now with these A tags is to specify the onClick attribute. You see, what we can do is to say onClick, it is supposed to do something. And here we can just use a simple JavaScript function which is called alert, and in there we can just stick in something like hello. So now if we re-execute this, we see that we can now click on this link, but nothing happens. But if I open this up in my browser, then there you see that if I click on this, then we get an alert that says hello. So that's nice. Inside of my browser it actually does what I want. So now what we have to figure out is how to put something into this onClick attribute that actually does something to our server function so that our server can react to our changes. And for that there is a particular JavaScript function that comes with Shiny, and it is called shiny.setInputValue. And with this function we can specify an input ID, let's call it click ID, and then we can set it to something. Here it's just throw in a random thing. And since this click is supposed to set an input value, namely the one of name clicked ID, what we can do inside of our server function is to observe this particular ID. So can create an observer, and in there we can just say print the input with the ID clicked ID. And now if we re-execute this, as we click on a link, we see that there happens something in the console. But now as I click on further links, nothing really happens inside of my console. I can click as much as I want, nothing really changes. And the reason why nothing changes is because all of the clicked IDs are always set to this weird string that we've just put in there. And so this observer isn't triggered because the input value never changes. works. But this is where our cryptic ID comes in. We can say, actually don't use something weird. Well, it will still use something weird, but use the weird thing that I want to actually use here, namely the cryptic ID that I'm iterating over. So what we can do to stick in the cryptic ID is to use the glue function to assemble a new string. And inside of there, we can use the argument of the function that does the iteration. And then when we re-render everything, we see now that as I click on these things, everything changes and my console updates. So now you might be wondering, what kind of black magic is this and why are we actually using these cryptic IDs? You probably still don't get the point of why we actually had to compute these random numbers. And the reason why we did that is because these IDs are now available inside of the source code of our app. If we look into our user interface and then inspect the code here, we can see inside of the on click, we can see the shiny set input value code that we specified. And this in itself isn't necessarily bad, but if we were to put in important IDs that could be inferred just by guessing, like doing ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, then someone who sees this source code could technically just say, you know what, I'm just going to execute some weird code using the ID 6, because if he's seen the ID 5, he might guess that 6 is also a valid ID, so it helps to obfuscate everything by using these weirdly random generated strings. And since we're using way too many random things here, it is kind of hard, if not impossible, to find a valid ID by guessing. So that's why I'm always trying to create a cryptic ID whenever I'm trying to use this little trick here. And also, this teaches us that what we see here is really nothing but simple HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that happens without even Shiny doing anything, namely this on-click thing is always possible. We've seen that just now with the alert. Here we're just using this Shiny specific function that sets an input value to make changes available inside of our server so that we then can trigger actions inside of our R code. That's a really powerful technique and you can use it everywhere, but there's still one thing that is kind of bothering me here. Actually, there are two. Let me show you. For example, if I click on this show me button here, then you see that my console only reacts once. If I click the same button again, then my console doesn't change. And if someone wanted to click the same button twice, then on the second try, nothing would work. And to avoid that, we have to enforce that the input value actually changes. And the strategy for that is really simple. Before we set the input value to its final value, we're just going to set it to something else first. So here we can just say set it to something else and then set it to what it's supposed to do at the end. This will make sure that the change actually happens, but the way Shiny and reactivity is set up, it waits all the way until the end, until all of this is executed. So this is why inside of your console, you'll only see the cryptic ID. Don't believe me? Let's try it. So here we have our app, and now as I click on this top button, I see this ID, and as I click on it again, I see this ID once again. So this means my code triggered again, and I never see this weird random stuff that I put in there. So that's a neat trick. But there's also one more thing that is annoying me, namely this null thing here. This happens at the start of my app. If I reload my app, you can see here I haven't clicked anything and it is still null. And this happens because as I start my app, this input clicked ID isn't defined, but I'm still observing it. So let me just bind this to the event that input clicked ID is changed, and that way I'll get rid of this null that happens in the beginning. But of course, as I click on the buttons, everything still works. Alright, so far I have called the links that we see inside of our app buttons, but they don't really look like buttons, so we might want to change that, and I'll show you how to tweak this with a couple of CSS keywords. Let's check that out. To make these changes happen, all we have to do is to set the style attribute of our link, and then we can use the HTML tools package to call the CSS function. And now we just have to specify a whole bunch of CSS properties. For example, we can specify a background color, we can specify a border color, and we can also make sure that we use round borders. And now if I re-execute this, we see now that this looks more like a button, but the border is kind of close to the text and it feels stressful to me. So let's also add in a little bit of padding. And while we're at it, let's also make a change so that as my cursor hovers over the link, it actually changes to a pointer so that it feels like a link. See how this is still the same cursor as before? I'd like to have it as a pointer. And if I use the cursor attribute and set it to pointer, then everything should work like I hope. And now we have a little bit more padding. And as I hover over this, we see now that I have a pointer thingy that can click my button. And now it actually feels like a button. If we wanted to, we could also also thrown a little bit of bootstrap classes to style things even easier. We could say class is shadow, and now if we re-execute this, we see now that my button has a little bit of shadow around it. But it also has some underlining, which I don't like, so let's also make sure that text decoration is set to none. And that way the underlining is gone, but the text is still blue, so we might as well also make the color into the same hex code as the border. Sweet, looks much better, and now we have a button which has a slight shadow behind it. This is always a nice little effect to make a button or an element pop out a little bit more. So as you can see, it's really helpful to know some HTML, CSS and JavaScript to enhance what Shiny already gives you even further. And this is because Shiny fundamentally brings you into the world of web development, which is a huge topic. And I cannot possibly cover everything inside a short YouTube video like this when it comes to this large world of web development. But thankfully, I know people who created a great course about Shiny that will teach you everything you need to know about it. And it includes a whole bunch of stuff that teaches you even more advanced tricks. And it also covers way more stuff from web development. And I know that the creator Verle has put in a whole bunch of work into this. So I know that you'll get a whole bunch of value from this. And if you want to check it out, you can use my code REP10 to get 10% off all of their Shiny courses. And also this code works if you want to check out some of their other data science courses. So make sure to check that out if you want to level up your Shiny skills and support this channel. And now let me show you the other technique that I promised you at the beginning of this video. You see, I promised you a pop-up window as someone clicks on the button, and I haven't really done that yet. So let me show you how to include so-called modals using Shiny. Namely, what we need to do is to filter our data set using this cryptic ID, and then we can create a so-called modal that pops up, and then we'll just display the data that corresponds to the filtered data, which is the data that corresponds to the cryptic ID. So here what we have to do inside of our observer is to simply call the show modal function, and this function needs a modal user interface. Namely, you can create one using the modal dialog function, and inside of there you can stick in all of the things that you want to show inside of this pop-up menu. For now, let's just leave it empty and source this script. And now as we click on this, we see that an empty menu pops up and it already has this dismiss button. So then inside of the modal dialog, we can say, just take this data set, filter it so that the cryptic ID corresponds to our input, which currently is just the clicked ID. Then we select all but this cryptic ID columns because this is not data we want to display in our modal. And then we have to realize that this code will basically give us one table with one row and a bunch of columns, and we can transpose that using the pivot longer function, where we say that it's supposed to pivot all of the columns. And since all of these columns have different data types, we have to make sure that they are transformed to the same data type, namely to a character data type. And then we can just simply stick this new table into the GT function to create a table output. And that way, if we re-execute everything, we see that we get a nice little table inside of our modal dialog. And you might be wondering, wait a second, why is this table actually here when before to create a GT output we had to use a render GT function? And the funny thing is, we actually don't really need the render GT function in a whole bunch of cases, because really the GT function itself, if you just execute this part here, it creates an HTML table for you. So really it just produces HTML and CSS, and this is just the thing that is sticked into the modal. And then because it happens in the browser, it is just rendered nicely. The only reason why I used render GT here and GT output instead of just a regular UI output is because I wanted to have this bit of interactivity here. And this thing is a little bit tricky. So this is where this GT output and render GT thing help. But as you can see, you don't really need it. If you don't want to have the interactivity, you can just throw in the code like that. Fantastic. Let's take it up a notch by using the exact same technique inside of Shiny modules. It works pretty much the same, but there's one tiny tedious little thing that you have to worry about when you're using this kind of technique inside of Shiny modules, and I'll show you what you have to take care of. If you haven't seen my video about how to use Shiny modules, then I suggest that you check it out because everyone should use Shiny modules. But in this particular case, I'm showing you once again how to use modules because this little trick of setting input value, it becomes a little bit trickier when you use modules, and that has to do with namespacing and IDs, but we'll get there as I show you how to do it. For now, let me just throw in a module skeleton, namely just a thing that gives us a tag list and a module server. Let's name it table UI, and here we can use the name table server. And what we have to do now, actually let's move this code closer to our app code. What we have to do now is to stick this GT output into our UI. We have to make sure that this is wrapped into the namespace call, and then inside of our server function, we just have to stick in the code from before. And then inside of our main UI, we can use the table UI with a ID, let's call it table, and inside of our server we can use our module server, and we have to make sure that it uses this same UI. So now if we re-execute this, everything should work as expected, and here we see that we have a table, but as I click on the buttons, nothing really happens. And if you've understood what this namespacing function, this NS call does, then you probably know why. You see this function prefixes all the IDs with the ID of the module. And this is important because then you can replicate UI parts without having to worry about duplicate IDs, because this namespacing function will take care of it. And the magic behind modules makes sure that inside of your module server, you can use the IDs as is. But if we look into our code again, so if we look into the user interface, we see here that it still uses the Shiny input value clicked ID. It doesn't actually change the ID, prefixing it with the module ID. And that's why nothing works there. So really what we have to make sure of is that the code here wraps the clicked ID into a namespacing call. But this namespacing function is actually only available inside of a module server and module UI. So that's why we have to take this part out of the general logic and inside of our server function override this data frame by recalculating it by appending a new column using mutate, and in there we can use the code from before. So now if I indent this properly and re-execute this, then we see that, okay, our code still works, so we don't get an error with the table, so our refactor here works, but of course we still haven't taken care of the button and the ID working properly. So let's do that. So let's wrap this ID into the NS function, and in there we can use the regular ID name, and then we have to repeat the same thing here. So now let's try to re-execute everything, and now we get an error that it says it could not find the function NS. And the reason why this happens is because inside of the module server, there actually is no NS call in here. You see, if we look into our module UI, we see that the first thing we do inside of the UI is to create this namespace function. But inside of our module, we don't actually do that. So we have to do it here, and we could technically take this code here and say, okay, create the namespace function like this. But if you nest module into module into module, then things might not work out, because then the ID prefixes aren't stacked on top of each other. So a safer way to avoid that is to actually take this session object, because it contains the namespace function as well, and you can get it by accessing the NS attribute from this. And now if you re-execute this, we see that, okay, the app now renders, and as I click on my button, hooray, it works. And really, I want to stress here the fact that this worked immediately is just due to preparation. As I was preparing this, I made a really silly mistake, and this kind of silly mistake cost me a whole bunch of time every time I try this little trick. So let me show you what mistake I do so that you don't repeat this mistake. You see, as I create this code here using the glue function, the common mistake is to forget these extra quotes here. You have a JavaScript function that as a first argument expects a string, so something that is quoted. And what often happens to me is to just take this output here as is, because as I think, okay, there will come an ID out of this, and actually this will work. If I forget these things here and if I re-execute everything, we see that I don't get an error, and I can click on stuff and nothing happens, but fundamentally I don't see an error. And really, I can only tell that there's something wrong if I go into the source code and have a look at this, and then I might see, okay, here there is something unquoted in this in comparison to all the other arguments that are quoted. And in fact, if I click on show me, as I click on this, I can see see inside of the console, I see that TBL is not defined. So this is your first hint that something might be off, but if you don't understand why you see this thing here, just think about what we have here. If this is unquoted, then we have TBL minus something else. And JavaScript tries to think, okay, TBL must be a variable, clicked ID must be a variable, and I need to subtract them. And then it tries to do that, and then the first thing it will tell us is TBL isn't even defined. I don't know what to do here. So this is how you can read this kind of error message here. So really, when you think you have tried this trick properly and the interaction doesn't work, check the console inside of your browser and also make sure that you actually quote all of the things here. But if you do, this trick can serve you really well and it can accomplish some remarkable things for you. Perfect. With that, we have unlocked a whole new set of skills that we can use to create fantastic Shiny apps. I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you did. And also, if you want to level up your Shiny skills even further, make sure to subscribe as I will upload new videos in the next weeks. And also don't forget about the ATHLYTICZ courses. Now, with all of that said, I say thank you for watching and I will see you next time.